Hello, and welcome to Dialogo, a podcast of the Division of the Social Sciences at the University of Chicago. In each episode, we interview an alum of a social sciences graduate program here at the University of Chicago, exploring their career path and reflecting on their time at UChicago. I am Kelly Pollack, Dean of Students for the Division of the Social Sciences.
And I am Paul Post, Deputy Dean in the Social Science Division here at the University of Chicago.
Today's guest is Anna Paulson, the Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Anna earned her PhD in economics from UChicago in 1994. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much.
Yes, we are delighted to have you here today. I wonder if you could start by telling us just a little bit about your current role at the Federal Reserve Bank.
Sure. So I direct and lead our research department. And so that means I um, have a group of, about 100 people who are all engaged in the policy mission of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. So many of those folks are economists with PhDs from a variety of institutions, including the University of Chicago. Um, and one of the big things that we do together that makes us distinct is before every FOMC meeting, we are preparing an assessment of the US economy, trying to think about what's going on with inflation, with growth, with the labor market, and helping to prepare the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, who sits on the Federal Open Market Committee, the group that makes monetary policy for the United States, so that he's ready to engage in that policy conversation.
Actually, that leads to my first question, which is just to gain a little more detail into exactly that role. So, is this something that you're preparing for the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago? But are each of the respective Federal Reserve banks, are they preparing similar reports for their own presidents? And so, is there, and how would that dynamic play out then? Is there a little bit of, hey, our job is just to simply help the president to be able to make an argument, or is there even like some competition between the different Federal Reserves in terms of the quality of the reports? Love to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. So, all right. So, monetary policy in the United States is run by the Federal Open Market Committee. There are 19 members, the 12 presidents of the reserve banks that are scattered across the country, and then 7 folks at the Board of Governors. And so, for the reserve banks, each reserve bank has its own set of experts, research department that are helping to produce analysis for their president. One distinct part of that is that we talk to lots of people throughout the region, so the Midwest region that the Chicago Fed encompasses. And so we're talking to small businesses, to labor leaders, to community advocates, to folks in a variety of industries to get their perspectives on the economy. And we bring that to the table together with, you know, analysis of data, models, and, a whole lot of, combining that mosaic together into a story of what's going on. So we're going to have different perspectives in Chicago because we have, a lot of manufacturing than, the folks in Kansas City might have, where there's more energy, more ag. And so those perspectives come together around that FOMC table to give a holistic picture of the economy.
So, take us back earlier in your life. What got you interested in economics? Was this something that, like, little Anna was like, I'm going to be an economist someday? Like, how did this come about?
So I think if you would ask me when I was 6 what I was going to be when I grew up, I would not have said economist. I was very taken by my mom's, um, she was a nurse, and so I was like, oh, let me try on that outfit and the cap that she wore. It was all very dramatic. So I would have said I wanted to be a nurse. What drew me into economics was in in undergrad, I took a few economics classes, and it kind of clicked as a way of making sense of the world. Very organized way to think about trade-offs, to think about, how do I get the best outcome in a given situation, conditional on what the constraints are that I face. And so that just kind of clicked with me. So that was one piece, right? Like it was something that really resonated with the way my brain worked. The other piece was it kept so many options open, right? I'm interested, I'm still curious about a whole wide range of things. And as, a 20-year-old in college, the last thing I was ready to do was to say, "Oh, I know I want to be, a geologist or something." I had no idea. Economics was required the fewest classes for the major at my undergrad institution. So I got to dabble. I got to take philosophy classes and math classes and science classes and language classes. So that was wonderful. And then as I went on in economics, it still really didn't require me, I still kept a lot of options open. And that was really valuable to me. So um, I came to the University of Chicago after a couple of years working at a small consulting firm. And I was coming to Chicago. This is, slightly embarrassing, but, my boyfriend at the time lived here, and we wanted to be in the same city, but, not at a stage where it made any sense to like actually do that, purely on its own. And this did not work out. So this was a good thinking. So Chicago, at first I was like, well, if it doesn't work out, I'll get my master's and I'll go back to my consulting job and I'll get promoted. But then as I went on, I mean, first of all, I love Chicago, but also just I could be an academic. I could work in public policy. I could work in industry. I could go back to my consulting job. The fact that that it didn't close off any options and let me really kind of go further and then decide where I wanted to specialize was really, really appealing.
On that note about deciding where to specialize, I mean, at what point during your time here at U Chicago did it start to become clear, first of all, that you weren't just going to take your master's and go back to consulting, but also that you wanted to go in the particular research direction that you ultimately end up going?
Terms of the first part of like, why did I stay? I mean, I did well, right? Like, I mean, and at that time in particular, one of the things that was distinctive about the University of Chicago PhD program in economics is it let people take a risk on themselves, which was really appealing to me. So that meant that, you started with a relatively large group of people, bunch of people left, some people stayed, but for me, at least, that was a great opportunity. And so I started at the University of Chicago. I didn't have any funding. By my second year, I had full funding. And, so that, it turned out to be the right decision for me and for me to make that bet on myself. And I really appreciated that opportunity. One of the things that I think is distinctive about Chicago is how it's really a set of tools. Like you're learning about a set of tools, you're figuring out how to engage in a conversation about economics that can be applied to a whole wide range of questions and problems. And so I followed my nose a little bit. I started working with Rob Townsend as a research assistant, had the opportunity to go to Thailand, ended up working with him, gathering data in Thailand. And it was kind of that positive feedback loop, right? Like I was learning things that were very abstract in the classroom. And then we were designing questionnaires to try to get at those abstract concepts in a concrete way by interviewing, rural households about their lives. And I loved being able to see that connection between, you know, a pretty primitive house in a village and a letter in a model. And sort of, making that connection, I think helped me understand the theory part better and appreciate the simplicity of a model. It's abstract by design. You're not trying to describe the real world, and yet it still had power to help explain important things that were real world phenomenon around, how were people putting food on the table, what were their, hopes and aspirations for the future. And so I really loved that connection.
What did you ultimately write your dissertation on?
So I wrote my dissertation on, and this is, I think, an example of how you can integrate ideas in economics, right? So in finance, there's very basic idea, right, that you should diversify your investments so that you're not going to be exposed to one stock and its fates and fortunes, right? You want to diversify risk, and so I applied that concept to how families in rural Thailand decided where to live and what occupations to have. And so there, if if you take the parents, parents are living in a rural area. Most of them are rice farmers. Their livelihoods are very much driven by how much rain comes in a given year. And so what I found was that their kids often went to places where they would be well set up to send money home if the rains didn't come where their parents lived, right? So that it looked like they were diversifying a stock portfolio, that they were choosing stocks that were not correlated with one another. And so you can see why I have a hard time kind of narrowing in and focusing on things. I took some concept from finance and applied them to development economics, and I that's the kind of thinking and ideas that I really enjoy, kind of trying to integrate things.
Hyde Park in the early 90s was pretty different than today, but I wonder what sorts of things you enjoyed doing while you were on and around campus.
So one of the things that really struck me when I was choosing graduate schools was I looked at a few places in the Midwest, and being at the University of Chicago, this is before anybody had seen, Harry Potter or whatever, but like it felt like how I imagined a graduate experience should feel, right? You're in a quad surrounded by these sort of gothic, impressive buildings. People took economics incredibly seriously, but also had a lot of fun with it. So that was just the architecture, I think, was one piece of my decision. Lots of studying, lots of time in the library, as you might imagine, but also trips to Chinatown, trips to Little Village. I remember a camping trip, lots of parties at people's houses. I think there's now like one house I lived in. I think it's now been torn down and is part of the hospital, but like there were kind of a few houses with 4 or 5 PhD students in economics living in each house. And so, we would have parties and invite people over and hang out. And all of that was a lot of fun. A lot of time at Jimmy's, and some really nerdy but fun at the time events where we would have skit shows to kind of, make fun of what we were learning and of our professors. So good nerdy fun.
Doctoral students still have good nerdy fun at Jimmy's. That hasn't changed.
Good, good. Very
Good
happy to hear
nerdy fun should be the new tagline for U Chicago, right? Instead of where fun goes to die, good nerdy fun.
good
I
nerdy
like that.
fun. I remember I think when I first went there with when I moved in, my dad and I drove out from I think I was in Boston at the time. So we drove out from Boston and we, went to hardware store. He bought me lots of tools. So I would have a tool kit for my new apartment. And then we went to pizza somewhere on 57th Street. I'm gonna blank on the name now. And while we were having pizza, a rat ran over like somebody's foot. And I was like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? And my dad is like, this is just perfect. This is great. Like this is how it should be.
To prospective students, there are fewer rats now, I think.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that was not that was the only rat I ever saw in my entire 5 years at the University of Chicago. So I am not worried about the rat population. I think that one was just there to, you know, I don't know, introduce me to my gritty urban experience or something.
Well, and you still live in Chicago to this day, so obviously it didn't dissuade you from wanting to settle here in Chicago as a whole. And actually, I think that leads nicely into the next question, which is: do you want to share a bit about your journey from U Chicago into your career path?
Sure. So after Chicago, I went and did a postdoc at Princeton, working, kind of more on development economics. And then I had the opportunity to come back to Chicago and to be assistant professor of finance at Kellogg at Northwestern. And that was that's kind of everybody starts out grad school, especially in economics, saying they want to do public policy, and then you get, kind of socialized into like, no, 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 you're supposed to be an academic. And so, that was kind of the dream, and I was very excited about that. And it was a tremendously rewarding intellectual experience. Broad department, really fit my interests and my style of research. Was fun to teach MBAs. A little intimidating to be, like the same age as the MBAs that you're teaching and whatnot. But you kind of get over that. So I was there for 7 years. I was not going to get tenure. Thinking about what I was going to do next. Wanted to stay in Chicago. I'd spent a lot of time at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago collaborating. Some with Rob Townsend on some projects gathering kind of similar data that we did in Thailand, but in Chicago. So I knew a bunch of people there. There was an opportunity to move there. And I started there in the community development part of the bank. So, as an economist in this little tiny community development research group. And so, our mission was really to study how access to finance influenced small businesses and families and especially low and moderate income households and communities. And what I found in that transition is I was so much more productive and engaged in this environment where I was working more with a team and where we were collaborating to produce, analysis of, whatever the issues we were studying. So I think, along the way, you kind of learn things about, in what environments are you productive? And for me, it's that environment where I get to work with other people, where I know other people are counting on, my inputs. I love writing research papers. I love all of that, but that can also be kind of a entrepreneurial task. And so you have to have a great amount of self-discipline to make that work. I can conjure that up, but it's a lot easier for me and a lot more fun for me when I'm working with other people.
What would you recommend for people who are maybe in a PhD program right now who are thinking about careers like yours, like going into the Federal Reserve or some sort of team-based research projects? How can they prepare for that as they're in a PhD program?
I mean, so I kind of came to this later, right? Where I kind of like, oh, hey, here's the environment where I'm really productive. So I would kind of turn that research lens on yourself a little bit and to really seek out some experiences during your graduate program so that you can work collaboratively on a project. Maybe it's a, joint research paper. Maybe you spend a summer as an intern at a PhD intern at a research institution somewhere like the Fed or something similar, or at in industry. Right now, many PhD students in economics go to go to big tech firms and things like that. So try things out. There's a little tension, right? You're trying to finish your program and write papers, and you're kind of narrowly focused on that, but in some ways you have the luxury of time during graduate school to explore. And so I would definitely put that experimentation not just about what subject matter interests you, but also about what are the types of environments where you're just naturally productive. Now, lots of people are going to come to grad school and like they're not going to need to do that exploration. They're just going to know. So this is probably more better advice for folks who had who are like me, who are like, I want to do everything. How do I decide? um,
No, I think that's terrific advice. And I think that's advice that obviously you just tailored it to the econ side, but I see that in all of the PhD programs where it's beneficial for students to be able to not just become solely focused on their dissertation, as important as it is, but to take advantage of other opportunities to kind of, as you say, get a sense of where are you most productive? What style of research work are
yeah.
you most productive? Because I've seen that. I think that was great about you sharing that story of realizing you're better in a team environment. I've seen that with so many PhD students where it's really about being in that team environment, kind of doing that style of research where they seem most productive. So I think this is great advice for all of our current PhD students to hear.
I wanted to ask, you're on the American Economic Association's, this is a long title, Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession. I think it's not a secret that this has been a longstanding issue, that there are just fewer women in economics. This is true in graduate schools. This is true in the profession. So I wonder if you could talk some about, what is the status, what does it look like right now, but also, what are you doing at the Federal Reserve to think about this? What can and should graduate programs be doing to address this issue? What should we all be thinking about to both address representation of women, but also the climate for women in economics?
So first of all, my term at the Committee on the Status of the Women in the Economics Profession ended at the end of last year. So I'm no longer on that board. But obviously this is an important issue. You know, anytime you're in a profession where, you're in a minority, you see things a little differently, and I think that brings has pluses and minuses actually. One thing that I've been really lucky in my career is, possibly with the exception of actually the University of Chicago and the faculty who were there at the time, I've always worked in places where there've been many women and many senior women, so I've had had the benefit of having, mentors and, people you can have conversations with about, how does, the maternity policy work here, things like that that aren't necessarily as obvious as you might hope. I would say that one of the things that's really changed over the last 30 years is that the profession has a lot more conversations like this and wants to understand much more, who feels welcome, who doesn't feel welcome, what are the implications of that. It's normalized having those kinds of conversations. We used to joke a little bit at the University of Chicago where it was like, free markets, everything works, the invisible hand, and it was kind of like, now go get a job, right? Like, so it kind of worked in that way too. And it was really different at some other programs where there was a lot more conversation around kind of the invisible rules. What do you wear at your job market talk? What do you talk about at dinner on the interview? Should you order a drink or not? Like little tiny things that matter. So that conversation, I think, is really constructive and really healthy, right? For everybody, not just for women, but I think that's really helpful. There's another part of the conversation which I think is a little bit less constructive, which is a little bit like, are there topics that only women study or that only men study? Like that I think is nonsense, right? Like we're using tools to understand the world. You want to bring a lot of different perspectives to understand the world. And so everybody's experiences are as valid as anybody else's in terms of what they bring to asking questions and trying to answer them. But that also means that it's important to have lots of experiences in any given room, especially if you're trying to do analysis that's related to public policy. And I feel like in my career, one of the times that really resonated for me was, I think it was in 2005. So I was at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. There was a dinner event with a local housing advocacy organization, and they were handing out awards and talking about the state of housing markets. And everybody who was working on the kind of community development, access to housing side was really grumpy and depressed and was like, bad things are happening. And I was baffled because homeownership rates were at their highest levels ever in the United States. They were growing and at their highest levels for Black families and for Hispanic families. And I was like, I don't understand the mood versus the statistics. Fast forward a few years and you're like, oh, now I get it, right? The folks who were kind of, on the front lines saw that a lot of the mortgages that were being underwritten in those days were not going to be sustainable and were not going to work out well for, probably the families that were getting them, but also, as it turned out, for the financial system in the country. And so, what I took away from that was the importance of having a lot of voices in the room and then listening to them, right? So, like that, that kind of goes back to that experience in Thailand, but also what we do now, where we listen to a lot of people and we combine insights from business people, community leaders, folks who are working with, representing labor, consumers, and kind of pull that together with the analysis and the statistics. And I think that's really important.
Just building on that, what from your perspective do you think is the best way for academia to create an environment where there could be the most voices heard and that those voices feel like they're being heard?
So my thoughts here come a little bit from watching my own kids go through college, and taking economics classes, and comparing and contrasting that with my own. So I went to a tiny liberal arts college, and you could take an introductory economics class that was focused on a question or a topic, sort of a seminar. It wasn't focused on like, you must know this math and then you get to study the interesting questions. It was a little bit more what are the questions? Why do we care about healthcare? Why do we care about immigration? Why do we care about trade? Why do we care about monetary policy? And then contrasting that with my son's experience, which have both been, you got to take 4 or 5 kind of tools based classes, and then you get to take the electives. And I guess I think that those are both valid approaches. One approach is probably going to get you the people who are interested in the tools, right? Or who are really patient and are, ready, willing to wait to get to think about the questions. And then the other piece is going to pull in the people who are like, I'm really motivated by the questions, by the topics, and then that's going to drive my engagement with the tools. Both of those seem fine. I guess I think it would be helpful to see more opportunities for people to engage with the questions and the topics, and like the things that are, the meaningful questions that the tools are meant to address. I think that that might bring different voices into the conversation and just, change subtly the emphasis, right? Not, how much topology and differential equations do you know? Even though you might need to know, statistics and all of that stuff in order to do a good, to have a successful career, but maybe that's not where you want to start.
Right? Real analysis isn't always useful for capturing reality.
Very, very true.
One thing I love that the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago does to bring people in the door and get them interested in questions is the Money Museum,
Oh,
which
yeah.
both of my kids, so my sons are 13 and 10, and they love the Money Museum.
That's so awesome. I remember once actually having to like recording a video to explain something in the Money Museum, and I think I said there were 13 reserve banks, and they're like, "Hold up, we're gonna have to record over that." There are 12 reserve banks. I'm like, "Oops, sorry." Um, but yeah, the Money Museum is great, and it is really nice, I think, to be able to have kind of tangible experiences that bring people. We should have lots of opportunities for people to have the careers that they want at many stages in life, and I think, that's kind of a strength of the US education system, but I think that's a really important one.
And for anybody who's in Chicago, you can go in for free and see lots of money.
Yes,
You do have to show
exactly.
ID because there's lots of
Yeah.
money, and you have to go through security because there's lots of money.
Yep, and then you can test your skills to see if you can figure out what the counterfeit bill is, and a lot of other good stuff.
I think also the Federal Reserve gives away, what do they call it? Fed shreds, but it's
Mhm.
shredded
Yes.
bills and little
Yes.
packets of it. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think I've talked to, I remember talking to my kids, like kindergarten class about the Fed and bringing in Fed shreds, and then the teacher being a little bit annoyed when the kids ripped up the bags and there's like, confetti made out of old money all over the classroom. I'm like, oops, sorry, they weren't supposed to open those.
So at this point, one thing we like to ask our guests is just, is there something that we should ask you? Is there something else that you think would be worthwhile to bring up, given the audience for this podcast, the alumni network, or any topic of any nature that you think we should be asking you about?
So, one thing that I found so distinctive about the University of Chicago economics program, and I think it's still distinctive, and it really mattered to me, was how seriously people took economics. Not just to understand, sometimes to a ridiculous extreme, right? Not just to understand, economic growth or labor markets, but to really try to understand a wide variety of phenomenon and kind of turn it on themselves sometimes in ways that were ridiculous. But I found that like just a really compelling part of the graduate experience. It was like the Berlitz program of economics. You were going to be immersed in economics, and so your classmate might be trying to apply the theory he learned to decide, like it was going to be good for him to leave his milk that was souring in the refrigerator to like, set the right incentives for his roommates to steal his milk, like, okay, slightly ridiculous. But then also just, it was so wonderful to be in a place where people were all really deeply immersed in the subject they were studying. That's really exciting. And so lunch conversations, hallway conversations, seminars, classes, I've never been in an environment like that before, and that was just tremendously fun and stimulating and exciting.
Bringing it back to the idea of nerdy fun. I
Totally nerdy fun. And definitely not for everyone either, right? I've had friends who were like, junior faculty at Chicago who were like, "Oh my gosh, could we just talk about like the movie that we saw? Like this is too much." So, you definitely be able to need to, escape from time to time too. But I found that like a really unique thing about the University of Chicago and maybe about economics in particular, but like that the idea that people were just like living and breathing it 24/7 was really cool.
And how can people follow you on social media?
So I have LinkedIn and Twitter, and papers and things that I write show up at our Chicago Fed website.
Excellent. We'll put links to those in the show notes. So, Anna, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you today.
Oh, it was a lot of fun and really fun to think back to those days at the University of Chicago, which I remember very very fondly. Lots of time and in the library late at night, um, but also friends I've made that I still have, and then just the intellectual stimulation was incredible and has really been an important part of my career.